And so you can read for yourself, but there's this sort of probably overly fraught question of the notion of the post-Canadian, themes of transculturation and post-coloniality, etc. So you can read through those. So to begin to address the first question, given a post-Latin American conception, can we speak about a post-Canadian conception? Elizabeth Armstrong refers to the construction post-Latin American in this way. Informed by critical positions engaged in a revision of theory and practices, this provocative nomenclature reflects the production of a discourse that can account for artistic expressions driven by local as well as global impulses that are grounded in historical specificities, yet that seek to go beyond them, close quote. A further note here is Paul Herkenhoff's idea that though Latin American artists between the 20s and 50s apparently embraced modernist philosophies and minimalist sensibilities, they were also developing other aesthetic languages that borrowed from a variety of other cultural styles and codes in a spirit that was directed at dismantling neo-colonial codes. Thus, Herkenhoff refers to this tendency in relation to Brazilian productions by evoking the term which we heard yesterday, anthropophagia, its English derivation roughly translating as cannibalism, in order to reinforce notions of absorption or borrowing. So the post-Latin American operates in part to signal that the Baroque no longer operates in relation to monolithic nationalist narratives. And as some of you may know, to move on to think about a Canadian context, the assumed nationalist visual narrative in Canada is one based on an unpopulated northern landscape. And just as in Latin America, where the adherence to a colonial project was undercut by a complex of other forces and influences, in Canada we see through the veil of northern landscape to a more complicated and resistant expression with regard to place. So here I want to briefly trace a bit of history of landscape art in Canada that leads to what I think is the Neo-Baroque sensibilities of artists like Diana Thornycroft. In his essay, An Iconography of Nationhood in Canadian Art, historian Brian Osborne offers the following rather utopic thought by writer Michael Bell, who was speaking at a conference on documentary art in Canada in 1980. And Bell said, "Visual images form a continuum with our imaginative responses to our contemporary environment. They will, if their currency can be increased, help to prevent the destruction of many of our cultural values, and will also further our respect for the variety of cultural themes that constitute the cultural whole of Canada," close quote. Certainly the history of painting the landscape in Canada charts the development of a pictorial project that evidences an initially colonized visual field that gave way to a developing tradition more closely allied with the specifics of the geography and the material sensibilities of the subject. In the mid-19th century, landscapes in North America and in Canada specifically were produced according to the conventions established by English artists such as Turner and Constable, and categorized by historians such as John Ruskin and William Gilpin. Osborne's comment on artist George Heriot could be applied to any number of artists, including Homer Watson, who I show you here. And Osborne said, as is so often the case, it was convention that framed his vision of the new environment he encountered, rather than the environment which challenged his vision. It's interesting to note that over and against the mid-19th century depiction of the land as romantic and often unpeopled, the production of Aboriginals at the time, utilizing wood and bark, emphasized the natural world and its subjects' place within it. And according to Elizabeth McLuhan and Tom Hill, the birch bark scrolls of the Ojibwa Midewiwin shamans could be viewed as two-dimensional plans of the ceremonial procession of the Longhouse, as well as a four-dimensional statement of arrangements in the spiritual world. Osborne notes that the development of a national historical identity was well served by the efforts of genre painters such as Francis Hopkins and by historical illustrators, but it was the work of Tom Thompson and the Group of Seven which contributed most to the development of a national identification with a distinctive sense of place. So while the range of subjects the group portrayed was vast, they became most known for images of a primordial, unpeopled north. Roald Nasgard has attributed some of this impulse to the symbolist landscape movement that was current in Finland, Norway, and Sweden in the early 20th century. Nasgard argues that the movement was in fact the final stage of the 19th century romantic landscape tradition, and that Thompson and his colleagues were well aware of it, in part through an exhibition held in Buffalo in 1913. Such influence is coupled with the Theosophist view that the spiritual, cultural, and aesthetic renaissance would come from the north, were at the heart of the group's project. The ethos that drew the Group of Seven together and came to be associated with its work was one of a triumphal northernness. So an ideology of utopic northern distinctiveness came to reflect the iconography of Canadian landscape, particularly in the mid-20th century. But indeed, the northern-spirited images of the group were thought by many Canadians to have simply replaced one set of foreign images, derived from the English, with another set of exclusive visuals which emanated from metropolitan Toronto, and thus did not represent the breadth of Canadian continental scope. So the particularity of the cultures of Eastern Canada, the prairies, etc., came to be considered in the mid-20th century then to be pictorially better served by other image makers, including people like Alex Colville, Christopher Pratt, William Kirlick, Emily Carr, and Aboriginal artists Norval Morrisseau and Jesse Unart, for example. So the regions had thus come to be understood as areas of peoples, along with rocks and trees and snow. So to move on to the Hinterlands exhibition, the photographic works of Diana Thornycroft are often touted for their unavoidable ability to both seduce and unsettle a viewer. In Hinterlands, Thornycroft furthers her commanding oath by presenting the recent Group of Seven Awkward Moments series. In this project, the artist deploys toys and photographic depictions that present plastic artifacts as gloriously seductive despite participating in troubling or provocative situations. That being said, Thornycroft has such control of her numerous mediums, both material and social, that the works in Hinterlands are richly mordant. What is more, the Group of Seven Awkward Moments series is notable for the fact that many of the group's iconic paintings are here presented as cheap, stagey backdrops for narratives that grab our attention and refuse to allow nationalizing reveries or contemplation. In Group of Seven Awkward Moments, March Storm, Jordan Bay, 2007, a boys' hockey table set is placed center stage with a Bruegel-like melange of figures, Mom and Pop, the family pet, a funny uncle, set to one side, intent on the game, and on the other, a stampede of traumatized wildlife is shown retreating from the setting. In the background, the painting March Storm sways in red and purple in mawkish sympathy with the scene. This is entertainment, bathos, and critique presented together. And she does actually use posters of these paintings and actually adapt them in some way. So these are kind of hyperbolized Group of Seven paintings, if you will. This artist participates in a project that's simultaneously critical of a monolithic vision from the past, yet fraught with contradiction and competing narratives. In Beaver, Wu at Tanu, and Wu at Tanu, there's a series of vectors that operate to invoke the history of colonialism, a feminist rereading of Canadian art history, and an apocalyptic sense of environmental anxiety. And the feminist part is related to the fact that this is actually an Emily Carr painting, and Emily Carr was the woman kind of ally, supposedly, of the Group of Seven, but was never allowed to be a member of the Group of Seven, and she owned a monkey named Wu. And here we have, here we have Wu being taken off by the American eagle, I guess. And then, of course, we can't tell if it's the beavers that have got to the totem poles ahead of the woodsman. So there, as I say, there's all these kind of multiple vectors that are, I think,